In the year 1816, the winter that followed the great volcanic darkness had not yet loosened its grip on the north of England, and Northumberland wore its cold with the particular stubbornness of a place that had always suspected the south of being too comfortable. The previous summer had brought almost no warmth. The sky had remained low and yellowed through the growing months, the harvests thin, the nights arriving too early, and the land north of Durham had taken on by January a quality of resigned endurance older than any single season. The village of Harrow Cross sat in a crease of moorland 8 miles from the nearest market town, and above it, on a rise of broken limestone, stood Harrowmere, the ancestral seat of the Viscount Ashford, a house so old and so long neglected that the locals had taken to speaking of it the way they spoke of the dead, with a careful lowering of the voice and an instinctive sideways glance toward the hills, as though expecting the hills to offer some confirmation that the living in their caution could not. The east wing had been closed for 11 years. The gardens, which under a previous viscount had been celebrated from Alnwick to Berwick, were now a tangle of blackened rose canes and frost-heaved stone paths, the topiary reduced to shapeless humps beneath the January snow. Like the mounds of some ancient burial ground, no one had thought to mark with anything more informative than silence. The house itself was not ruinous, its bones were sound, its roof held against the worst of the weather, and smoke rose from 3 of its 9 chimneys every morning, but it had the unmistakable quality of a place that had been breathed in, never out, as though some long grief had settled into its walls and simply refused to leave, finding the cold stone a more congenial host than any warmer shelter. It was to this house on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of January that Miss Cecily Vane arrived. She was 22 years old, the elder and plainer daughter of Sir Edward Vane of Vane's Hollow in Suffolk, and she came not by private carriage, for there was no private carriage to be had, but by a hired coach that smelled of damp wool and somebody else's tobacco, with 2 small trunks strapped to the roof, and a leather satchel on her lap that contained everything she considered irreplaceable. Her mother's miniature painted in watercolour on ivory, a volume of Thomson's Seasons, with her own annotations in the margins in a hand considerably smaller than the printed text, and 14 shillings that she had saved over the course of a year in the expectation that she would need money of her own, though she had not, until now, known precisely why. She was not a remarkable woman by the measures her world applied. She was of middling height, and her hair was a brown so undistinguished that it defied further description, worn in the plainest of arrangements because she had never had the patience for ornament, and her dress was grey wool, clean, well mended, a little worn at the cuffs in the manner of a garment that has been thoroughly good and is approaching the end of its useful life with considerable dignity. But her eyes were the quality that people remembered after they had forgotten everything else about her, a clear, serious grey, the colour of the sky above the moor that morning, lit with a watchfulness that was neither suspicious nor unkind, but simply present, entirely awake to whatever was in front of her, and disinclined to flinch from it. She pressed her gloved hand to the coach window as Harrowmere resolved out of the low cloud, and tried to see it plainly, without the assistance of fear. The village had not been welcoming. There had been a moment at the Post Inn where a woman sweeping the step had looked up at the hired coach and then looked again, and then had gone inside without finishing her sweeping, and a boy of perhaps 12 had stared openly from across the lane, with an expression that was not curiosity, but something older and more wary. Cecily had heard the word before the coach door was fully shut, traitor, spoken to no one in particular, almost under the breath, but clearly enough that she could not pretend she had not heard it. She had said nothing because there was nothing to say that she yet knew how to say, and she was not in the habit of speaking before she understood. She was to be betrothed to a man the Crown was said to suspect of having passed intelligence to the agents of a foreign enemy during the late wars. She knew this, and had known it, for 3 months. The coach lurched on the broken drive, and Harrowmere drew closer, its pale stone face impassive above the ruined gardens. A single light burned in a downstairs window. Cecily straightened her spine, because her spine was the one thing she could govern at this moment, and she kept her eyes open. The morning her father told her began with a smell of damp paper and sealing wax, which Cecily would always afterwards associate with the end of one portion of her life and the beginning of another, in the way that certain unremarkable sensory details become the permanent furniture of a significant memory. Sir Edward Vane had a study that functioned less as a room of work than as a room of avoidance. Its shelves held ledgers he had not opened in years, a broken theodolite that had belonged to his own father, 3 hats belonging to men who had never returned to claim them, and a writing desk whose surface was perpetually obscured by papers that had been shuffled rather than addressed, moved from one side of the desk to the other in the rhythm of a man who finds the gesture of engagement more sustainable than the thing itself. On the morning of the 15th of October in the year 1815, when the year was already beginning to exhaust itself and the beech trees outside Vane's Hollow had turned the colour of old sovereigns and dropped their leaves in dry, rattling clusters onto the gravel path, Sir Edward had stood at that desk with his back to his daughter and explained, with an odd, careful formality, that he had secured for her a future. The word future had struck Cecily then as precisely the wrong word, the way a slightly wrong note in an otherwise correct melody strikes the ear, not disastrously, but with a small persistent wrongness that lodges in the body rather than the mind and cannot be talked away. What her father meant by future was this: Lord Julian Ashford, Viscount Ashford of Harrowmere in Northumberland, had agreed to a formal betrothal. The terms, as Sir Edward laid them out in the flat, careful tone of a man reading from a document he would rather not be reading aloud in a room with his daughter in it, were as follows: £300 of accumulated debt, principally owed to a wool merchant in Ipswich, a solicitor in Norwich, and a cousin of Sir Edward's, who had lent money with diminishing goodwill over the course of 7 years and was now making noises about the sort of legal proceedings that would attract notice, would be discharged in full upon the completion of the betrothal. The field at the south end of the Vane property, which had been mortgaged against that debt and which Sir Edward had been on the edge of losing since the previous summer, would be returned free and clear of all encumbrance. In exchange, his eldest daughter would proceed to Northumberland at the earliest practicable date in the new year, and enter into a formal betrothal with Lord Ashford, with a view to marriage before the close of the following summer. Cecily had stood very still throughout this recitation. She was wearing her second-best dress, and her hair was not yet properly pinned, because she had been called downstairs before she was ready, and she was aware with the peripheral precision of the genuinely shocked of the cold draught from the study window, and the sound of a cart on the road below, and the perfectly ordinary quality of the world continuing its business while the shape of her life was being altered in a room that smelled of damp paper. She did not weep. She had never been a woman who wept easily, not because she was without feeling, but because weeping had always seemed to her a statement rather than a release, and she was not yet certain what statement was appropriate to this particular moment. She asked 3 questions. The first was whether Lord Ashford had been consulted, or whether the arrangement had been made without his knowledge, and her father said that Ashford had agreed and had, in point of fact, proposed the financial terms himself, which she found more surprising than the arrangement itself. The second question was whether the Crown's suspicions regarding Lord Ashford's conduct during the war had been formally resolved, and her father said that they had not, which was, Cecily recognised, the most honest thing he had said in the entire conversation, and she credited him for it privately. The third question was whether she had any choice in the matter, and her father set down the paper he had been holding and looked at her for the first time that morning and said, with a heaviness that was not cruelty, but was none the less absolute in its weight, "No." She remained standing for another moment. Then she said, "Thank you," which was perhaps a strange thing to say, but she could think of nothing else that would not make things worse, and she had long believed that maintaining the surface of one's relations was a form of mercy that cost relatively little and prevented a great deal. The letter Lord Ashford had sent, confirming the arrangement, arrived 3 days later. It was written in a precise, rather old-fashioned hand on paper, of genuinely good quality, heavier and creamier than anything available in the Vane household, and Cecily noted this as the first real evidence she had of Julian Ashford as a physical being, rather than a legal abstraction. The letter was brief and entirely correct. It welcomed her to Harrowmere with a formality so complete it left no room for any other tone, confirmed the date of her expected arrival, named the housekeeper as Mrs. Holt, and closed with a sentence about hoping the journey north would not prove too fatiguing for her. It was signed Julian Ashford in a hand that pressed perhaps a little harder than was strictly necessary onto the paper, which she noticed and did not interpret. She read the letter twice, folded it with her own care, and placed it in the satchel with her mother's miniature. She spent the following week repairing the hem of her best dress, darning 3 pairs of gloves with a patience she was very deliberately not allowing to become stoicism, and learning by the mechanism of quiet repetition to hold the idea of Harrowmere in her mind without either dread or hope, simply as the next thing. The housekeeper, who met Cecily at the door of Harrowmere, was a woman of perhaps 60, with the upright posture of someone who had long ago decided that the house would not defeat her, and the expression of someone who was not entirely certain the same could be said of its new visitor. Mrs. Holt was not unkind. She took Cecily's outdoor coat with a care that bordered on the solicitous, directed a young maid of perhaps 15 to see to the trunks with sufficient firmness to ensure it would be done properly, and offered tea in a tone that made it clear the offer was genuine rather than formal. But she was watchful in the particular way of a loyal servant whose loyalty has been tested across a long, difficult winter, and whose primary concern is, and always has been, the well-being of the house and its master, rather than the comfort of a stranger who has arrived by hired coach with very little luggage and an expression of deliberate composure that tells you nothing and everything at once. She led Cecily through a stone-flagged hall that echoed with every step in a manner that made the silence feel managed rather than natural, and into a receiving room on the ground floor, a room that might once have been handsome and now bore the slight hollowness of a space where warmth has been economized over many consecutive winters. The fire was lit but modest, placed as though warmth were a limited resource to be deployed judiciously, the curtains drawn against the grey afternoon light, 2 chairs positioned before the hearth with the stiff precision of furniture that is rarely used and is aware of this fact. Cecily removed her gloves, held her hands toward the fire for a moment, and then sat in one of the stiff chairs and placed her satchel at her feet, and was still. She had a capacity for waiting that she had always possessed, but had refined considerably during the years of her father's financial difficulties, when waiting had been the principal activity available to a woman with limited resources and no recognized authority to act. She sat, and the house ticked and settled around her, and she listened to it the way she might have listened to any voice she had not yet learned to read. It was in this stillness that Lord Julian Ashford found her 20 minutes later. She had heard nothing of his approach. He moved with the unhurried economy of a man who has spent a long time in situations where noise was a liability, and when the door opened, she rose, as was proper, and turned to look at him with the same direct and composed attention she brought to everything she was uncertain about. He was 30 years old and tall, and he wore the slight thinness of a man who had been in the field for a long time and had not yet entirely reacquainted himself with regular meals and the comforts of a roof that was unambiguously his own. His hair was dark and cut without any particular concern for fashion, slightly longer than was entirely current. There was a scar at his jaw, not dramatic, not disfiguring, but present, a pale seam that ran from the edge of his chin toward his left ear in a manner that suggested the work of a blade handled with intention rather than accident. His eyes, when they finally settled on her, were a deep and somewhat complicated grey, not unlike the colour of the winter sky she had been staring at through the coach window for the entire length of the journey, and they held in them a wariness she recognized at once as the expression of a person who has learned, by a sequence of specific experiences, to expect very little from any new encounter, and has made a reasonable peace with that expectation, though the peace is of the enforced rather than the freely chosen variety. He bowed. She curtsied. He said that he trusted her journey had not been too arduous, using almost exactly the words he had used to close his letter, which he noted with a faint internal precision. She said that it had not been. He expressed a hope that she would find Harrowmere tolerable during the winter months, and she said that she was certain she would. These were the correct things to say, and they said them correctly. Standing on either side of the modest fire, with the January afternoon pressing against the curtained windows, and the house continuing its low interior conversation of settling stonework and distant draughts. The exchange of obligatory phrases lasted perhaps 4 minutes, and each phrase was properly formed and properly delivered, and nothing of any interest was said. But there was a moment, brief, precisely calibrated, when Lord Ashford had finished the formal observation he was delivering and had not yet begun the next, when his eyes rested on Cecily's face with an attention that had no apparent social purpose, and stayed there for just slightly longer than the architecture of polite first conversation required. It was not an impertinent look. It was not warm. It was the look, she decided, of a person encountering something they had not quite expected and choosing for this moment to suspend their assessment rather than commit to it too early, which she thought was the most intelligent thing she had seen from him yet. She returned his gaze without flinching, because she was not frightened of being looked at by someone trying to understand her, and was in fact rather accustomed to it, and after a moment he said something unremarkable about the hour of dinner, and Mrs. Holt appeared at the door with the timing of a woman who has spent decades appearing at the right moment, and Cecily was led away through the echoing hall toward the upper rooms. Behind her, she heard nothing, not a sigh, not a footstep, not the scrape of a chair rearranged. She imagined him standing at the window of the receiving room as she climbed the stairs, looking out at the grey and broken gardens, still conducting his assessment in the privacy that had been returned to him. Sleep did not come easily to Cecily in those first days at Harrowmere, and she had learned long ago not to struggle against its absence, but to occupy the wakeful hours with something purposeful, which was how she had always managed the insomnia that visited her during periods of transition, not by forcing sleep, but by giving the wakefulness somewhere useful to go. On the fourth night of her residence, when the house had been dark for several hours and the cold outside the windows had acquired the deeper quality that distinguishes the hours after midnight from those merely after sunset, she took a candle from the holder on her nightstand and made her way downstairs through the corridors in search of the library, which Mrs. Holt had mentioned on the first day as being on the west side of the ground floor, and which Cecily had not yet had occasion to find. The house was different at night. During the daylight hours it maintained a kind of grey dignity, the indifference of old stone to the concerns of its human inhabitants. But in the hours after midnight it became something closer to a living organism. The corridors breathed draughts through gaps that were not apparent by day. The boards spoke in a low and irregular register of contraction and settling, and the shadows gathered in the angles of the walls with an almost deliberate quality, as though the house were drawing itself inward against the cold in the way that a very old person draws inward against it, not with fear, but with the habituated knowledge of what the night requires. Cecily moved through it, without hurrying, trailing her candle flame along the panelled walls, and found the library door on the second turning of the west corridor unlocked, swinging inward on its weight as though it had been expecting her. The room inside was exactly the sort of room she would have chosen for herself. Large, slightly disorderly in the manner of a working rather than a decorative collection, smelling of old leather and cold ash and something mineral she associated with maps and the kind of paper that has been handled out of doors in variable weather, saturated with the character of documents that have been read for information rather than pleasure. The shelves were full but uneven, with gaps where volumes had been removed without replacement, and she ran her finger along the nearest case, reading spines in the candlelight, histories, travel accounts, works on navigation and natural philosophy, several volumes in French, one in Dutch. It was behind a folio of coastal charts that she found the map. It had not been filed with the rest of the cartographic material. It had been placed there, slipped between the folio's boards and the adjacent shelf with the careful casualness of something concealed not against a thorough search, but against any casual eye that was not already looking. She drew it out and carried it to the central table and unfolded it and held her candle over it. It was a map of the Low Countries, the Belgian provinces, the Rhine territories, the coastal regions of the Netherlands, drawn on paper, thinned by repeated folding and stained along the crease lines in the pattern of a document that has spent time in a coat pocket in wet weather. The geography was accurate and detailed. What arrested her attention was the annotations. At intervals across the face of the map, in a small, careful hand, she recognised at once as Lord Ashford's from the letter she had read in October. There were marks she could not interpret, combinations of numbers and letters, small symbols that might have been compass bearings or station markers or something else entirely, arranged in a pattern that was clearly systematic and clearly not the work of an amateur annotating a favourite view. Several of the marks had been struck through with a single clean line. Others were circled and left unresolved. One cluster in the region of the Rhine had been struck through and then circled again, and then struck through once more, as though a decision had been made, revisited, and made again. She stood looking at it for a long time, the candle guttering occasionally in a draught she could not place. She was still looking when she heard the door. He moved quietly, as she had already observed he always did, and she had not heard him in the corridor, but when she turned he was in the doorway, his own candle held low at his side, dressed in the loosened dark coat and absent cravat of a man who had been awake and had not troubled with appearances. He looked at the map and then at her, and she saw in his face something she had not seen in the 4 days of their acquaintance, a swift, controlled tightening, a thing that would have been naked alarm on a less disciplined man, and in him resolved itself, in under a second, into absolute stillness. He crossed to the table. He did not take the map from her, which was the thing she had expected, and which his not doing told her more than if he had. He looked at it with her for a moment, as two people might look at something of mutual interest, and then he said in a voice that was entirely level that the map was from his time on the continent, and that he had an amateur's interest in military cartography. She said that she could see that. He said that he would find her a better atlas in the morning if she had an interest in European geography, and she said that she would be grateful for that. They stood on either side of the table with the annotated map between them and the candles burning and the house listening, and when she finally returned to her room she was certain of one thing only, that the fear she had glimpsed in his face was not the fear of a guilty man caught in a lie, but the particular fear of a careful person watching something fragile pass very close to the edge. Lady Philippa Crane arrived on a Wednesday morning without the courtesy of prior notice, in a travelling carriage of ostentatious blue, and the company of a maid, a footman, and a small silken dog of considerable temperament who had apparently been trained, or had trained himself, to bark at anything that failed to meet his owner's standards. She was celebrated, Cecily knew, had been celebrated for several years as one of the genuine beauties of her generation, the kind of woman about whom portraits were commissioned and sonnets attempted, and whose appearances at public assemblies caused a recalibration of the room's entire attention, a reorientation of bodies in space that she had learned to receive without acknowledging that she received it, which was itself a kind of mastery. She was perhaps 28, and she wore her beauty with the settled ease of a person who has never had to imagine existing without it. The dark auburn hair dressed with sophisticated simplicity, the pale and precisely arranged face beneath it, the figure that her dressmaker had apparently built an entire professional reputation upon, and would have been distressed to lose. She swept into the entrance hall of Harrowmere as though she were arriving at a house she already owned and had only temporarily permitted others to occupy, embraced Mrs. Holt with the practised warmth of a woman who understands that servants see everything and have long memories, and turned to Cecily, who had come to the top of the staircase when she heard the carriage and could not in good conscience pretend she had not, with a smile of such immediate, polished, comprehensive warmth that it took Cecily only a brief moment to identify it as manufactured entirely from habit, deployed without much consideration of whether the recipient warranted it. "My dear," said Lady Philippa, in the tone of a woman who uses terms of endearment as a precise instrument of condescension, "you must be the fiancé." Cecily said that she supposed she must be, and Lady Philippa's eyes travelled over her with the swift efficiency of a woman conducting an assessment she has long since learned to conduct invisibly, and the broadening of the smile that followed told Cecily that the assessment had confirmed what she had hoped it would. She had been a dear friend of Lord Ashford's for many years, Lady Philippa explained to the entrance hall in general, since before the war, since before the unfortunate difficulties, since before everything, as she put it, with a slight emphasis on everything that invited speculation about the precise nature of what everything contained. She had simply felt she could not leave the county without calling. Lord Ashford appeared at the top of the stairs some minutes later. He descended them with the expression of a man who has just been presented with a complication he had hoped to defer indefinitely, and has not yet decided how to manage it, and he greeted Lady Philippa with a courtesy so precise in its calibration, cordial enough to require no explanation, cool enough to require none either, that Cecily felt a certain involuntary admiration for the technical achievement of it. They had known each other a long time, and this was visible in the particular distance Julian maintained as Lady Philippa moved within it, the way she positioned herself always a half-step closer than social convention strictly required, and the way he, with no movement that could be called a withdrawal, managed always to remain at the edge of the space she was attempting to define. Dinner that evening was better than the occasion deserved, owing entirely to Mrs. Holt's skill and determination. Lady Philippa was at her most accomplished throughout it. She spoke of mutual acquaintances in London, of the season just past, of houses she had visited and the one she intended to visit next, all with the fluent ease of a woman who has spent 20 years ensuring that dinner parties proceed according to her preferences, and who reads every table as a room she is managing rather than merely occupying. She asked Lord Ashford about his plans for the spring with a familiarity that implied she had a right to the information, and Julian answered in the vaguest possible terms, without appearing to evade, which was another technical achievement she observed with quiet attention. And then, once, very briefly, with the timing of someone who has rehearsed the moment in advance, Lady Philippa spoke of the continent. It was a single sentence inserted into a passage about the pleasures of European society in the pre-war years. One met the most charming people abroad, the most unexpectedly interesting people, and she let her gaze rest on Julian for precisely a fraction of a second longer than the sentence required. The continental friends, she called them, and the phrase carried in her mouth a quality of quotation, as though she were alluding to something that everyone present ought to understand. Julian reached for his wine-glass and set it down without drinking, and replied on an entirely different topic, and the dinner continued. But Cecily had watched his face for the length of a breath between the remark and the reply, and what she saw there was not guilt and not shame. It was weariness, deep and thoroughly unglamorous, the face of a man who has heard this particular note sounded before, and knows that the only dignified response available to him is silence, because every more active response has already been taken from him by the nature of what he is carrying. Lady Philippa remained 3 days, which was 2 days longer than Cecily had hoped, and 1 day longer than Julian's composure could sustain without visible cost. And when she departed, she pressed both of Cecily's hands between her own at the front door, and smiled her most expansive smile, and said that she did hope dear Cecily would find every happiness at Harrowmere in the tone of a woman saying with perfect grace precisely the opposite. It was not the kind of morning that invited company or conversation or any of the ordinary social exertions that Cecily found, by the 3rd week of her residence, had become the most quietly tiring part of life at Harrowmere, not because they were frequent, for they were not, but because each one required a quality of sustained surface maintenance that she found oddly effortful when deployed for an audience of one. The sky was the particular uniform white of cloud, so complete that it had ceased to be clouds at all and become simply the ceiling of the world, lowered closer to the earth than usual, pressing the moor down with a companionable weight. The frost had not lifted by 10 o'clock, and the air had the quality of held breath, of a pause between one cold event and another that has not yet decided on its nature. Cecily had not planned to walk. She had come outside because the house, for all its considerable size, had a way of accumulating within its rooms the weight of whatever feeling had settled in them most recently, so that on certain mornings the small parlour felt full of last night's unsaid things, and the library felt full of the map she had not mentioned since the night she found it, and she had needed, with the uncomplicated practicality of a woman who has always understood her own requirements, to be in a space that did not have a ceiling. She was wearing her grey wool coat and her second-best gloves, the best pair still waiting for the mend on the left thumb, and she had taken the path along the south wall of the kitchen garden because it was sheltered from the moorland wind, and she could walk there with some equanimity. She did not hear Lord Ashford until he was beside her, which told her something about the quality of his step and about the quality of her own absorption that she noted without distress. He was not dressed for a deliberate morning walk. He wore his plain, dark outdoor coat and the heavy boots he used for the estate boundary, and his hands were bare, which he registered as an error given the temperature, and his hair had the quality of a man who had been awake before dawn had occurred to him, and had not revisited the matter since. He fell into step beside her, without announcement or any particular social preparation, as though they had already established the habit of walking together, which they had not. They were quiet for some time. The silence between them was not of the uncomfortable kind that generates pressure to be filled. It was the silence of two people who are each genuinely at home in their own interior lives and who have enough respect for the interior life of the other person not to interrupt it without cause. Lord Ashford began to speak eventually, quietly, naming the beds as they passed them, the leeks that had been there and the turnips and the parsnips, the long bed along the east wall that had been asparagus before the east wing was closed and which he had not managed to revive in the years since, and the corner by the old stone trough where something had always grown that defied identification, not dangerously but persistently, which he mentioned with a tone that was entirely new, a quiet, sideways amusement, the texture of a man who has not forgotten that small things can be worth noting even when larger things are very bad. She asked him if he had attempted to manage the garden himself, and he said that he had tried in the first winter of his return with some effort and considerable optimism, and that the results had been instructive, which she understood to mean they had been poor. She laughed, briefly, not politely, but genuinely, and he turned to look at her with the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he had not expected and is not sure whether it is safe to acknowledge it. She told him about her mother's garden at Vane's Hollow, the ambition her mother had brought to the cultivation of sweet peas, which she had believed with the conviction of the genuinely committed could be trained to any surface given sufficient will and the right support, a belief that had proven largely and beautifully correct and had transformed the east wall of the hollow into something of a local wonder for 2 months of every summer for 20 years. Julian listened in a way that was its own form of intimacy, not with the polite patience of a man waiting for a pause in which to speak, but with actual attention, following the thing being described, and she found this more warming than she had anticipated it would be from him. He asked one question about the colour of the sweet peas, and she said they had been a pale lilac that in certain lights looked almost white, and he said nothing further, but the question itself had been sufficient. At the garden gate they stopped. The path went north toward the open moorland and south back toward the house, and they stood at the junction for a moment without resolving it, and she was aware that they had not spoken once about the betrothal or Lady Philippa's visit, or the accusations or any of the arrangements that had brought her here. The absence of those subjects had the quality of a gift freely given, rather than strategically withheld. When they parted, Julian back toward the house and Cecily on toward the moor for another quarter-hour of solitary walking, the cold had not gone, but it was no longer the entire fact of the morning. The courier arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of February, a young man on a good horse who carried himself with the slightly elevated bearing of someone employed by an institution that considers its correspondence to be the most consequential correspondence produced in England on any given day, and has communicated this conviction in some form to even its most junior staff. He asked at the door for Lord Ashford by name and title, and was told by Mrs. Holt, who received him with her usual composure, that his lordship was out riding the north boundary fence and was not expected back before the hour preceding dinner. The young man produced from his saddlebag a letter sealed with dark red wax, bearing above the seal a frank mark that Cecily, who had come to the top of the staircase when she heard the knock and had not yet descended, being uncertain whether to do so, could not quite read from that distance, though the angle of the stamped impression suggested a government office of some seniority rather than a personal correspondence. The courier gave a brief bow toward the interior, replaced his hat, and departed down the broken drive. Mrs. Holt came upstairs with the letter, carrying it in both hands with the formality she reserved for official correspondence and for the kinds of situations that might later be reviewed by people more important than herself. She came along the upper corridor toward the room Cecily had adopted as her sitting room, and at the corner she met Cecily coming the other way, and in the brief interval of that meeting she extended the letter toward Cecily with the automatic deference of a woman whose instincts about household hierarchy had been formed over 40 years of service, and had not yet fully recalibrated themselves to the precise status of a fiancée who was not yet a wife but was also not, by any reasonable measure, still a guest. Cecily took the letter. She did not correct the mistake immediately, which she was later able to examine with reasonable honesty. Correcting it would have required extending the letter back, and she had already read the name on the outside. The direction was to Julian Ashford, Viscount Ashford, in a hand she did not know, on paper whose weight told her something about the institution behind it, and below his name there was a notation in a different hand, not private, which she would have returned at once, not urgent, which she might have carried to him personally, rather than waiting, but a single word she had encountered before on certain documents in her father's study in the years when his affairs had briefly touched the edges of public business. Official. She carried the letter to her sitting room and set it on the writing table and stood before it for some minutes, which she thought was the most informative part of what followed, because it confirmed that what happened next was a decision rather than an accident, however imperfectly sustained. The wax was old and therefore more fragile than modern sealing wax, and when she took the letter from the table and turned it in her hands, the seal cracked and separated cleanly along a line that was already present in the wax, which was the kind of thing that happened when a letter had been in a saddlebag for some hours in the cold. She unfolded the letter to the point of the salutation and the first two sentences, and then she stopped. She could not have explained the distinction to anyone's full satisfaction between reading two sentences of a letter not addressed to her and reading the entire contents. The moral mathematics were not clearly in her favour either way, but the distinction felt real, and she held to it with the stubbornness she reserved for the things she most wished to believe about herself. The salutation was formal and correct. The first sentence acknowledged receipt of his lordship's most recent communication, and expressed satisfaction with the continued progress of the matter under discussion. The second sentence was the one that stayed with her through the remainder of the afternoon and the long hour before Julian's return. The continued necessity of the cover arrangement, it said, had been reviewed at the highest levels, and it was the settled opinion of those levels that the present circumstances required its maintenance for a period that could not yet be precisely determined, and that his lordship's patience and fortitude in this service remained as valued as it had ever been. She refolded the letter. She pressed the broken seal pieces back against one another with her thumb, which accomplished little that was practically useful, but seemed the necessary gesture. She carried the letter to the top of the stairs and sat on the window seat there, looking out over the front drive, where the courier's horse had left shallow marks in the frost, and waited for the better part of 2 hours. When she heard his horse on the drive, and then his step in the hall below, and Mrs. Holt beginning a sentence about the afternoon's caller, she came down the stairs, and she said, before Mrs. Holt could complete her account, that the letter had come to her by a household mistake, and that she had opened it before she understood it was not addressed to her, and that she had read 2 sentences and no more, and that she was sorry. Julian was still wearing his riding coat. There was mud on his boots, and he stood in the hall below her and looked up at her face with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not anger, not alarm, but something that had gone entirely still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness, a stillness that preceded something rather than following it, and she felt the weight of it in her chest before she had found any words for what it meant. That evening she was in the small parlour at the back of the house, the room she had quietly adopted because its window looked out over the moorland rather than the broken front garden, and because it was the least formal room on the ground floor, and because it had no particular association with anything that had happened at Harrowmere before her arrival, which meant it held none of the weighted silence that had gathered in certain other rooms over the previous years. She was mending the left thumb of her best glove, the mend she had been postponing since her first week at the estate, finding always some reason to address the second-best pair instead when she heard the knock at the door. He knocked rather than entering, which she registered because in the week she had been at Harrowmere he had not, to her knowledge, knocked on any door. She said, "Come in," and he did, and he closed the door behind him, with a precision that was neither hurried nor casual but very deliberate. The precision of a man who is uncertain about many things at this moment, but is entirely certain about the importance of this one threshold being properly secured. He did not sit. He stood near the door for a moment and looked at the room, the sewing basket, the book lying face down on the low table where she had set it to answer the door, the single candle she had placed to serve both as light and as company. And then he came further into the room and stood by the window, looking out at the dark moorland which gave nothing back at this hour but cold glass, and the reflection of the candle behind him. She waited. She had learned by now that Julian Ashford was not a man who could be hurried through the approach to a difficult subject, and that the silences he placed at the beginning of such approaches were not theatrics, but structural. He was arranging something, she thought, not performing the arrangement. He said that he owed her an explanation, and she said that he owed her nothing and meant it, and also knew that the absence of obligation might make the explanation easier to give and more complete when it came. Then he spoke. He spoke with the stripped, economical directness of a man who has carried a particular narrative too long to retain any interest in how it sounds, and what he said to her was this. In the spring of 1813, when the intelligence services of the Crown had identified a network of intermediaries actively passing military information from certain British officers to the French intelligence apparatus operating out of the Low Countries, he had been approached by a senior officer of the Foreign Section and asked whether he was willing to work within that network as an apparent sympathiser, while in fact reporting its structure and its membership back to the Crown. The operation had required him to appear to carefully positioned observers as a man whose loyalties were doubtful at minimum and at maximum purchasable. This appearance had been manufactured with care over a period of months. Certain documents had been placed where they would be found, certain conversations had been arranged. A letter, whose precise contents he did not specify, but whose discovery by the appropriate parties had been the letter's entire purpose, had been composed and delivered through a channel that could be observed. He had been abroad under this arrangement for 18 months in the years 13 and 14, and during that period the network had been identified in its full extent, and several of its principals had been apprehended and tried. When the war ended and the peace was declared, the question of his cover had been assessed and deemed to require ongoing maintenance. Several members of the network had not been apprehended. A premature clearing of his name might alert those unapprehended members that the penetration of their operation had gone deeper than they currently believed, which would make their eventual apprehension considerably more difficult. He had been asked to continue to appear as the man the whispers described, the traitor, the man who sold information, the cloud over the Ashford name, for a period that had not yet been specified. The isolation of Harrowmere was not retreat. It was the form the posting had taken in peacetime. He stopped speaking and the room was quiet. The fire had burned considerably lower, and the candle between them gave its narrow, careful light. Cecily had set down the glove and the needle at some point during his account. She was not certain when, and she sat looking at him across the short distance between their chairs, at the quality of his face in the candlelight, the composure of it, and the thoroughgoing tiredness beneath the composure that she had been observing for weeks without the information to understand it. And she thought about the boy at the Post Inn, and the map in the library, and the scar at his jaw that had not come from falling. She said, "Is anyone else at risk because of my knowing this?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in the candlelight, beneath all of his ordinary careful construction, something that was almost undone. He said that she was the first person outside the arrangement who had been told, and that whether the telling placed anyone else at risk was a question he could not answer with certainty, and that he had told her because he was not able in conscience to continue living in the same house and seeking a shared future with someone who had already seen too much to be protected by continued ignorance, and who deserved, if nothing else, the honest account of what kind of life she had been brought into. Mr. Harcastle arrived at Harrowmere on the following Tuesday, under the pretext of inquiring about the eastern boundary fencing, which shared its line with a Crown surveying road that had been the subject of some unresolved correspondence between his office and the previous Viscount's man of business. He was a compact man of perhaps 50, with grey temples and the precise, unreadable collar of a senior government official who has learned that the projection of neutral correctness is the most useful professional disguise available to him, and he carried a leather document case that he set down once in the entrance hall and patted with the brief, unconscious protectiveness of someone whose most important possessions are always paper. Mrs. Holt received him correctly and went to find Lord Ashford, who was in his study. Cecily had come to the upper gallery when she heard the carriage, as she was in the habit now of observing what arrived at Harrowmere before deciding what to do about it, and she came down the stairs quietly. She was not quick enough. In the interval between Mrs. Holt's departure for the study and Julian's emergence from it, 4 minutes, perhaps 5, Lady Philippa, who had returned 2 days earlier without explanation, and had been moving through the house with the quality of a woman awaiting an opportunity rather than a visit, came along the corridor from the east drawing-room and met Mr. Hardcastle in the entrance hall. They exchanged a look that contained more information in its brevity than a longer acknowledgment would have, the look of two people who have met before in a context that neither is prepared to name in the present circumstances. Lady Philippa said something in a tone too low for Cecily to hear from the foot of the stairs, and Mr. Hardcastle made a small affirming gesture, and Lady Philippa opened the door to the east drawing-room, and he followed her in, and the door closed. Cecily stood for a moment in the corridor outside it, and listened. From within came Lady Philippa's voice, light, precise, carrying the particular rhythm of a prepared argument delivered to appear spontaneous, and beneath it, the lower, more infrequent sound of Mr. Hardcastle asking short, confirming questions. She heard enough to understand the shape of it. Lady Philippa was describing her long acquaintance with Lord Ashford, certain observations she had made of his conduct during the period under question, certain contacts and correspondences that were, she said, matters of accessible record for anyone who knew where to look and had the authority to look there. And she was placing before Mr. Hardcastle the picture of a man whose loyalties had been at the very least divided, and at the most something considerably worse. She was doing it with genuine skill, Cecily noted, feeling a cold admiration that she did not permit to become paralysis. There was nothing demonstrably false in what Lady Philippa was saying. She was offering observations rather than accusations, suspicions rather than evidence, and presenting them with a careful reluctance that made them seem more trustworthy than any forthright allegation would have. Cecily opened the door. She opened it without hesitation in the manner of a woman entering a room she has every reason to be in, and both Lady Philippa and Mr. Hardcastle turned to look at her, with the expressions of people who have been interrupted at the centre of something and are reassessing. Cecily introduced herself as Miss Vane, Lord Ashford's fiancée, added that she was sorry to interrupt and was plainly not, and sat down in the chair nearest the window with the unhurried composure of someone who has decided where the conversation is going and intends to accompany it there. Mr. Hardcastle recovered first and said that they were simply discussing local matters. Cecily said that she was so glad, as she had been meaning to speak with someone about precisely that, and she wondered if she might be of assistance, having been resident at the estate for some weeks now, and having, as a consequence, a rather complete account of Lord Ashford's movements and activities during that period. She then provided, over the course of approximately 12 minutes, a detailed and entirely invented account of his whereabouts on 3 specific dates that Lady Philippa had been about to name. She knew this because she had been listening through the door, and because Lady Philippa's cadence had been building toward specifics. The account she constructed was modest in its claims, rich in the kind of domestic and agricultural detail that resists disproof, and placed Julian Ashford at Harrowmere or in its immediate vicinity on each occasion, occupied with fencing and tenant matters and the assessment of the north pastures' drainage, all things plausible in themselves and described with sufficient specificity to suggest personal witness. Mr. Hardcastle made no notes. He listened with the quality of attention of a man who is measuring the credibility of the source as carefully as the content, and when she had finished, he thanked her and departed within a quarter of an hour, with the bearing of a man who has come to confirm a hypothesis, and has instead found the hypothesis complicated. Lady Philippa waited for the sound of his carriage to fade entirely from the drive before she turned to look at Cecily. The luminous assurance was still present in her face, but it had been cut through with something that was not quite surprise and not quite fury, though fury was certainly one of its components. She looked at Cecily for a long time in the cold east drawing-room, and Cecily looked back at her, and neither of them said anything at all, which was, Cecily thought, the most honest exchange they had had in the entire duration of Lady Philippa's visits. The candles in the library had burned down to their last inch by the time she heard his step in the corridor, which told her that she had been sitting there considerably longer than she had intended, which told her in turn that she had needed the sitting more than she had known when she chose the chair. She had come to the library in the hour after Harcastle's departure, and Lady Philippa's subsequent and very quiet withdrawal to the upper rooms. Lady Philippa would be gone by morning. She understood this, without requiring any conversation, in the same way one understands the end of bad weather by the quality of its last hour. And she had sat in the old chair nearest the fire, with a book held open in her hands, and the map still in its place behind the coastal folio on the shelf, and the frost forming again on the window glass as the evening came fully down over the moor, and the house settled into its night sounds. She was not troubled in herself. She had done what had seemed necessary, and she did not regret it, and she was not frightened of the consequences, which she had considered with some care and found to be manageable. But there was a particular species of tiredness that was not the tiredness of exertion, but of sustained precision. The tiredness of having been, for an extended period, exactly as controlled and as articulate as the situation required, and of having done so without visible effort, which was the part that cost the most. She was very tired in that particular way, and the library was a good room to be tired in. When Julian came in, she heard him this time, because the house was quiet enough, and she was no longer occupied with the performance of reading, and his step in the corridor was audible from several yards away. He opened the door and found her, and they looked at each other across the room for a moment that had the quality of recognition, not of strangers becoming acquainted, but of two people who have been through the same weather and are standing on the other side of it, still themselves, but slightly altered, the way things are altered by weather. He came to the fire and crouched before it and placed a log on it, not because the fire was in urgent need, but because it was something purposeful to do with his hands, which she had learned was a reliable sign that he was feeling something he had not yet found the language for. When he stood and turned to face her fully, she saw that the careful layering he wore habitually, the containment, the controlled presentation, had been thinned by the evening's events to the point where the face beneath it was simply there, present and undefended, and she found she had been waiting, without knowing it, to see it. He said that he did not have adequate words for what she had done. She said that she had not done it for words. She had done it because she believed him. He said that she had placed herself in considerable difficulty on behalf of a man she had known for 6 weeks, and the word difficulty was an understatement that she thought he knew was an understatement and deployed anyway, because the larger word would have required him to acknowledge a debt he was not yet comfortable naming. She said that she had placed herself in an honest position on behalf of a man whose character she had had 6 weeks to observe, and that 6 weeks of genuine observation was, in her experience, quite adequate to form a sound judgment if one was paying real attention, which she had been from the first afternoon in the receiving room when he had not taken the map from her hands. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression that she recognized now as his version of being caught without an argument, which was rare enough that she thought she should note it. Then he crossed the room to the chair, facing hers, and he sat in it, and he reached across the small interval between the two chairs, and he took her hand. He took her left hand, which still wore the mended glove, the best glove, the mend finally accomplished, and he held it between both of his without urgency, as a man holds something he intends to hold for some time, and sees no reason to be careless about. And she did not take her hand back, but let it rest there, and looked at the fire rather than at him, because looking at the fire seemed the right way to hold the moment without either breaking it or making too large a claim upon it. She was aware of his hands, the warmth of them through the wool, the particular quality of deliberateness in the way he held her hand, which was not the thoughtless warmth of impulse, but the considered warmth of a man who has decided something and is acting accordingly. She was aware also of the room, the dying fire, and the last inch of the candles and the frost, beginning its second application on the glass and the house around them, which had the quality, for the first time since her arrival, of a place that was choosing, very quietly, to allow something good inside its walls. She did not know how much longer they sat. The fire burned lower, and neither of them moved to address it, and outside, the frost was sharp and clean on the moor, and the stars over Northumberland were clearer than she had yet seen them from this county, and in the library the last candle guttered once, as though considering its position, and then steadied, and held on into the darkness for as long as it reasonably could. The letter from the Crown Office arrived in the second week of March, when the frost had not yet entirely left the Northumberland ground, but the light had begun its long, unhurried northern shift, a brightening of the sky's whites into something warmer, a lengthening of the afternoons by increments so small that one only noticed them in retrospect, and a gradual yielding of the moor's frost browns toward a colour that was not yet green, but was becoming willing to consider it. It was a different kind of letter from the one the courier had brought in February, longer, bearing a different seal, signed by an official whose name Cecily did not recognise, but whose title she understood to be of considerable seniority within the Foreign Office. Julian read it in the entrance hall, still wearing his outdoor coat, in the cold draught from the front door. Cecily had been crossing the hall from the morning room when he opened it, and she watched his face as he read. He read it through without interruption, and then folded it, with the same care he brought to all paper, and looked up across the hall and found her. The formal arrangement, he said, had been reviewed in its entirety and brought to its conclusion. The cover was no longer required. Certain matters that had remained outstanding had been resolved. He would be receiving official correspondence in due course to confirm the public correction of the record, and there would be, he added, with the faint, dry quality she had come to identify as his closest approach to irony, a process by which the corrections would be made. She said that she was very glad. He said that he was glad also, and for a moment they stood on either side of the entrance hall, and neither of them said anything further, because what there was to say was already present in the room, and did not require more words to be understood between two people who had learned, over the preceding weeks, to be accurate readers of each other's silences. 2 weeks after that, on a Tuesday, in the last days of March, he asked her. He came to the kitchen garden in the early afternoon, where she had taken to spending an hour when the weather allowed, tending the beds she had been quietly working since the thaw broke, turning the soil in the ones that might yet recover, removing the dead growth from those that would not, which she found a satisfying occupation in its blend of the practical and the hopeful. The asparagus bed along the east wall had put up its first thin spears in the third week of March, green and improbably determined in the dark soil, and she had been watching their progress with the quiet pleasure of someone who has bet on something against the odds and is being vindicated in her patience. Julian came along the south wall path and stood beside her at the asparagus bed and looked at the small new spears without speaking. Then he said, "I would like you to stay." He said it in the voice he reserved for things too important to ornament, stripped of everything except the thing itself, and she understood at once that stay meant something considerably larger and more permanent than its 4 letters. She had been wearing her gloves, both of them, both thumbs now mended and sound. She did not think about what she did next. She took the left glove off and placed her bare hand in his, which he had extended not in expectation, but in the way one extends a hand when one has said a true thing and is willing to receive whatever the other person offers in return. He closed his fingers around hers, and they stood together at the asparagus bed in the thin March sunshine, with the moorland wind running along the estate wall and the old house watching from its rise of limestone above them, and the cold in the ground was withdrawing the way it always withdrew in the north, not defeated, but simply finished, making room for what came next. The ceremony was held in the local chapel 3 weeks after that, on a Friday morning of thin sunshine through plain glass windows, with no elaborate arrangements and no grand assembly of persons, a small gathering of those who were necessary, the words required by law and faith, and the ring that Julian had given her the evening before in the library, producing it from a small leather pouch, with a care that suggested it had been waiting there for considerably longer than the previous evening. Mrs. Holt wept briefly and without apology, and it was, Cecily thought, the most human thing she had yet seen the housekeeper do. They returned to Harrowmere in the afternoon. Mrs. Holt had lit every fire in every habitable room, which was more fires than the house had sustained simultaneously in a long time, and the warmth from all of them moved through the stone corridors in a way that changed the house in some fundamental register, not softening it, for it was too old and too serious for softness, but filling it, the way a room is changed by the presence of someone in it who has decided to remain. That evening, in the small parlour with its single window over the moorland, Cecily sat with the window opened 1 inch into the cold spring air. The first opening, the first deliberate admission of outside into inside, and read aloud from the volume of Thomson she had carried in her satchel from Suffolk all the way to Northumberland, its margins dense with her careful notes, while her voice moved through the room and out through the 1-inch gap and across the dark moorland, and the old house listened as it had always listened, only now to something it was not in any hurry to have end.